All right, thanks Lee, thanks for that intro. Hi everyone, it is an honor to be here. It's quite surreal to be here. Like Lee said, I think this growth of this community has really outstripped our expectations. And for those who don't know me, my name is Schrock, and I was at Facebook from 2009 to 2017. I'm one of the 3 co-creators of GraphQL. I moved on, I just founded a new company in a totally different space, but I'll skip talking about that. But I first want to thank the organizers for inviting me and allowing me to talk on whatever topic I deemed appropriate. So when Nicholas and Johannes and crew got this particular title in their email box, they were probably like, oh my God, what are you doing? Going totally off message, the old man with his stick on the yard saying, don't take away my monolith. But I think by the end of the talk, you're going to see that this is not quite as off message as it appears to be. So this is what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to do yet another brief retelling of the origin story of GraphQL, but from a slightly different perspective, particularly the context of the release, and especially in terms of the system that was built atop. I'm then going to talk about the open sourcing process, but again, I'm going to talk about the context of that open source release, especially versus the initial development, on 2 dimensions in particular. One, the fact that this was released to a front-end ecosystem, and how that affected the rollout of the ecosystem, and how I think we need to adjust the ecosystem to adjust to that. Then we also released this in the context of the microservices wave, which is a totally different context than we developed it inside of Facebook. And I'm going to editorialize a bit about how I think that a lot of the popularity of GraphQL is actually compensating for some of the negative side effects that are often unaddressed from hyper-fractured microservices architectures. And then I'm going to talk about kind of the future of GraphQL-Native and the opportunities to improve the ecosystem on the server side, of which I think it is an incredibly underserved and underdeveloped area of the ecosystem. So we've come a long way. Lee tweeted this screenshot out about a year ago on the 5th anniversary of GraphQL. And this was a diff that started this whole mess in February 28th, 2012. So this is kind of an RFC, meaning request for comments diff, but this had the full working system, the parse tree, the runtime, et cetera. And this, again, came out of the history of we were rewriting our iOS app, and we used to deliver markup from the server, and we needed to switch to APIs. But I wanted to pick out a few relevant details from this diff, from this change set, that I think are relevant to what we're going to talk about. But some fun things. First, naming is hard. So these were our possible alternate futures here. Should I call it GQL, GraphQL, then QL? Lee vetoed GQL, because there's actually this thing called Google Query Language. So then we moved from Supergraph to GraphQL. I think that was a good move. Dodged a bullet, kind of, because then we spent the rest of our lives explaining how it's not a query language for graph databases, which I'm sure you've done a couple times. The other relevant detail from this diff, which described here, is that it was a one-to-one mapping with this pre-existing business object layer. So the comment here is this maps pretty cleanly to the ent and query layer, which is why we were able to build up this abstraction stack very quickly. It was actually a pretty minimal runtime on top of this existing abstraction, which, for example, took care of permissions. People always say, what do you do with permissions in GraphQL? Well, the answer is we had already taken care of it, so we didn't put in the language. Here's another possible alternate future. This was how it first looked like. Apparently, I forgot about the existence of curly braces, so made the scope operator this then thing. And then actually, the earlier manifestation of GraphQL, the fields weren't functions. You would actually build up the field with kind of like method builder syntax. And this was actually because this was just a direct representation of our internal APIs, which kind of this object-oriented thing. Anyway, I think it's interesting. But from the get-go, we knew this was going to be a thing. From the initial diff, when you write something, you have that feeling, you're like, this is going to be good. So very confident that this was going to define the client-side implementation of the site for a while. And then, I think very early on in the project, Lee, Dan, and I all recognized this. And it was a really focused period where we had this leverage point to determine the architecture of the future. So just to go over these kind of GraphQL 1 facts, like Chuck Norris facts or something. So 1, interestingly, no client library. Nothing. Said nothing about the client. We were delivering JSON to the client. It was a monolithic, quotations, I will describe why I put a star in front of that, PHP app. That's what we built it on top of. The team that built it, i.e. us, was a full stack team, especially Lee. Dan and I don't have an artistic bone in our body, but Lee certainly does. We were a full stack team, but it was a back-end focused team. We were focused on server-side compute, right? It was not a front-end team at the time. It had, as I mentioned, a one-to-one mapping of the business logic layer. No JavaScript. React, I think Jordan was still on ads at the time and like making up React while building a single type ahead in the ads interface. And then the first client was iOS and then Android. Again, web wasn't in the picture. And this is all super interesting because it's truly remarkable how different this was from the open source release. The open source release was in the context of the React ecosystem. And we wanted to open source Relay, which, really high level description is React and GraphQL smushed together, right? And so in order to open source Relay, we need to open source GraphQL. And GraphQL didn't really have anything intrinsically to do with React. It was an adjacent technology, but we were like, this is a very successful brand. Let's just release everything under this banner. Because React was just taking over the world. It was like a rocket ship of open source tech, right? And React is not just a popular framework. It's like an incredibly important idea. But I won't get into that. I don't have that much time, so I can't go on all the sojourns and content that I want to. This was like my favorite article, I think, reacting to the launch of it for a couple reasons. One, they dog on the name. That's pretty funny. My favorite part is how they describe the Facebook engineering organization of the hipster catacombs, as if we're like serving each other espressos, twiddling our mustaches in the dark or something. But to illustrate the point, it was a very wise decision to release this to the React ecosystem because we were able to launch off that brand. So again, if you kind of go down and compare the two contexts, GraphQL v1, no client library. React, the open source release, very tied to a client library. GraphQL v1, one-to-one mapping with a business layer. Open source, totally agnostic to the backend. We just said, here's a function. Do your worst. It was a back-end focused team for v1. Released to a front-end focused community and adopter group. PHP server-side, we released open source to JavaScript. And it was built on a monolith. And we released to an existing ecosystem built on REST and Allowways microservices. The context of this release dramatically affected the way the ecosystem unfolded. If we would have released this at like a Ruby on Rails conference, the world would look way different. At least this part of the world. And kind of the net result of this was actually relatively predictable. Front-end developers love this thing. You pop a front-end developer in front of graphical, and they like start physically shaking, right? It sells itself, right? You start typing and things pop up. It's incredible. You show this to a back-end developer. There's terror. Which I actually think isn't a technical reality. It's a cultural and communication issue. So really concrete example, this happened 2 weeks ago. Airbnb did a post about how they adopted this tech. And they had this section about like the backend engineers figuring out what's going on. And they're like, oh my God. So you can kind of like visualize this, right? The scrappy JavaScript developer goes to the backend engineers, hey guys. And then you have to go to the backend high command, and many words are said, and there's a lot of copious amount of beard stroking. And then they're like, we can't do this. So the post is really interesting about how much of this was navigating cultural issues. And I found it super interesting that the backend engineers don't see the opportunity that GraphQL is to impose constraints on the client, right? Because through that type system, you can actually constrain the behavior of your front-end developers, pretty strictly, right? Exactly, only these orderings, only these types, You could like add metadata to the type system. It's actually an opportunity to really mold your client developer behavior as well as structure your backends. And it's an untaken advantage of opportunity in the ecosystem today. As a result of this vibe, the adoption of GraphQL in the community took on a certain dimension. We had these existing structures where clients were talking to REST APIs, and effectively the front-end developers wanted to use it, but they didn't want to thrash the back-end developers, so they did just enough GraphQL, just a little layer in front to talk to REST APIs, so that they could derive the value client-side without thrashing the back-end developers, right? This cultural context in which it was released affected the technical architectures of GraphQL throughout the ecosystem. But one unexpected thing happened. We were within Facebook. I don't know if Lee and Dan were more connected to the outside, but I was very inside the bubble. And so I assumed that all of these REST APIs were built on monolithic apps just like at Facebook. Lo and behold, the world looks very different. And so what actually happened is that you had GraphQL built out over sets of microservices in many different contexts or in many different installations throughout the industry. And this really affects the type of products that are built, the type of companies that were started. All right, so now on to some microservices. All right, so let's talk about microservices. So there's this famous line of, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And this is by this mid-century American man of letters named George Santayana. But there's a converse to that, which is those who learn too much from history are doomed to overreact to it. And that's just me. I just say that, but it sounds fancy. So I actually interpret a lot of the history of software engineering as developers encountering intense pain and then overcorrecting. And you could go on in all the different domains talking about all the cases of this happening. SQL to NoSQL, or data warehousing, the data warehouse to data lake, or even like the fight from normal JavaScript to templating to JSX is kind of this yin and yang, right, going forward. And I believe we are right in the midst of one of those overcorrections. And that overcorrection is microservices. So I'm not saying that microservices are bad. What I'm saying is that they're a tool. They are not a goal. What I hear a lot is like, oh, in the next year, our goal is to move to a microservices architecture. And I'm like, I reject the premise of that statement. Because your goal should be, we're delivering such and such a value to the organization or your users, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's kind of like talking to like a home builder or something. And they're like, our goal in the next year is to move to hammer-oriented development. It just doesn't make any sense, right? It's like, what are you actually doing? And because it's a tool, it has costs and has benefits. And with all these kind of pivots and corrections, it's generally about separation of concerns and what we're separating. And in the context of microservices, the number of concerns that are being separated under this banner is just crazy, right? So if you kind of list them out, kind of the traditional one is you separate the app into business logic verticals, right? So you have like the user service, the product service, the order service. I'm actually very skeptical of doing this early on in the process, and I'll get into that. But there's other stuff too, and I can't go, this slide could be the base of an entire another talk. This is like a personal pet peeve of mine, is that everyone uses this excuse to like have a bunch of repositories in their company. So now there's all these companies that have like more repos than engineers. This is like insanity at large. I'll be balanced about costs and benefits of different configurations within engineering organizations. I'm going to be totally unreasonable and straw man this one and tear it down. Don't do this. We have folders. Folders work. One repo, many folders. Your life will be way better, trust me. All right, that's my one really unfair rant. We're using microservices to take care of organizational boundaries, right? To reflect Conway's law, which is Conway's law is you ship the org chart, that the software system you build reflects the communication structures within the organization. So that's actually a pretty legitimate reason to switch to microservices. A lot of people use it to do language choice. It's like, oh, I can use Ruby, and I can use Python, and I can use Go. This is another one I'm super dubious about. It's like, you're an organization, you should bet on 1, 2, maybe 3 languages, because code reuse is good. You want to build up shared infrastructure between your stuff. You don't want to replicate business logic n times across your org. Doesn't make any sense. And then there's the one I'm a real big fan of, which is technology or scaling constraints. When there's a fundamentally different problem that requires fundamentally different systems, like for example, if you have a web tier and it's stateless and you can infinitely horizontally scale it, but you need a service that, for instance, saves state between requests in memory. It's a great reason to extract a service out of it. So the real rub happens here when you attempt to decouple what is actually coupled, right? And this is where the problematic pattern, in my view, of verticalizing your app along business logic domains can be very problematic, because these things are interconnected in reality in a lot of cases. And if you do this too early in your development progress, you actually get the worst of both worlds. And that's a distributed monolith, right? You have this like monolithic app that now you're crossing process boundaries. Now you're doing Kubernetes and service message, it says Envoy, and like you have to like go to the CNCF conference and like learn like 10 different things just to manage your systems, right? God forbid you have to debug these things across service boundaries and you distributed tracing. You're just buying yourself a ton of infrastructure costs. And it reduces your flexibility as well. So I have a thesis about this, and that's your affection for GraphQL in a lot of these cases is your subconscious, and it's telling you that you want the good parts of your monolith back. You want a single artifact where you can talk to it and get a cohesive view of the schema where all the interrelationships make sense. And when you're fetching all the data, for a particular view, and it's crossing the different business logic domains that are encoding your microservices, you don't want to think about that, right? And that's really, I think, the value of this. So let's talk about the future of server-side GraphQL and what I like to call GraphQL-Native. So this is kind of going back to the previous picture. This is kind of a very common practice in the ecosystem now. And where I think it should move to is something like this, where you have a beefier API gateway you can think of, where you can actually put in business logic, where you can actually take the data from your services and then actually use code and munge it up into a type system that your clients can better understand, where you're not leaking the details of how you subdivide your business domain across the service boundaries. So you want a unit of software that is responsible for delivering an integrated, cohesive, and flexible application ontology. It's a fancy word for a type system, right? Because the other thing that happens with microservices, right, is that you set it up by team structure, but what if the product changes and you want to reorg stuff? Well, now you have a team that owns half of one service and half of another, so you really are statically encoding your org chart in your service layouts. And then you still have services in this world, but they're factored across different domains. Like some of them I like to call capabilities-based services. Like in Facebook land, we had a service, for example, for issuing feed stories, meaning the feed ranking, because that was machine learned and you needed super fast compute, you need to hold everything in memory. Also, and I think this is super relevant in a serverless world, is that you can talk directly to a super scalable data source, like Cloud Native DB, Cockroach, Spanner, things of this nature, right? And this really actually simplifies your persistence layer. And then, yes, you can actually talk to an existing microservice, but one that's actually factored across a domain that makes sense. And this, of course, all depends on the context and your app. And spoiler alert, this is what a monolithic system looks like when you star it, right? Meaning that we called Facebook a PHP monolith, but it was a PHP monolith in that it had that layer which had the coherent type system, and we had dozens, and probably now today, hundreds of services that do all sorts of stuff. So is that a microservice architecture? Probably not, but if you squint and turn your head, it kind of is. It's just not necessarily isolated on this business logic domain axis. And I have to go fast now. I need a call to action though, come on, although the rant was fun. There are massive holes in this GraphQL server-side ecosystem because there aren't that many backends built with GraphQL from the ground up in mind. And I think there's a couple massive opportunities for people to do real contributions that have a ton of impact. And I kind of classify them into two modalities. One is fatter gateways. So moving these gateway gateway pieces of software to be the source of truth for client schema, but be more opinionated about what those are, right? And really start to encode more logic that takes care of cross-domain dependency issues, and then molding the schema to be kind of really tailor-made for the client developers. And the other, I think, huge opportunity in any number of languages is vertically integrated toolkits, meaning GraphQL toolkits where you start from the ground up, and it has opinions about scaffolding, code layout, opinionated abstractions in the native programming language, efficient querying, so like there are prefab patterns for dealing with n+1 issues and the impedance mismatch between the underlying relational store and the GraphQL abstraction. So the shorthand would be like a better Ruby on Rails, but for GraphQL, but in all the different native languages. There should be one of these in Python, there should be one of these in Ruby, there should be one of these in Go, all the major languages. And it's actually just a huge opportunity, and I think a way to kind of pivot this world back to be a balance between the back end and the front end. So with that, I'd like to thank you for letting me talk here, and I will pass it on to Leanne.